Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the trustees and governing body of the Cama Oriental Institute, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all this evening to the 176th birth anniversary celebrations of the late Cama. It is indeed a privilege for us to have renowned Orientalists and cultural scholars like Mr. Justice Sri Krishna and Mr. Nariman in our midst. You will wonder why year in and year out for the last 176 years we are celebrating the birth anniversary of the late Kharsetji Rustamji Cama. Not only was he a renowned scholar and savant, well respected all over the world in the last century and during the turn of the in the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century, but he was a man for all ages, greatly respected by one and all who came in contact with him. Kharsetji, in today's parlance, may be described as a good reformist Parsi Zoroastrian. Naturally, as is today, even in that age, there were a lot of good Parsi Orthodox Zoroastrians. And equally naturally, there was a terrific conflict of views between these two groups. However, although Kharsetji was criticized by the Orthodox group, which in Europe incidentally was led by his paternal uncle Mancheji Hormasji Cama, he was greatly respected as a human being. One may have torn Kharsetji's views to shreds, but certainly not his character and integrity. And he was well respected not only in the Parsi Zoroastrian community, but by all communities. In fact, the Anjuman-e-Islam in the latter half of the 19th century had a lot of theological disputes, which led to factionalism within that august institute. And it was the unanimous vote that Kharsetji should be called upon to resolve this issue. Born into a family of traders, Kharsetji from a very young age showed his interest in education and religious studies. Whilst he was 19, he was sent by his uncle to the branch firm of Cama and Company, which incidentally was the first non-European firm in England, to Canton to learn the ropes over there. Whilst he was in Canton, Indian railways were introduced and the first trial run was run between Bombay and Thane. Kharsetji was so impressed by it, and more so by the thought of what this possibility opened up for India, that he made a donation of an endowment for a prize to be awarded to the best university essay on the advantages of railways in India. The Board of Education in Bombay, which comprised Englishmen, had never heard of him as yet, and they were very, very impressed. He was also, like Napoleon, firmly of the opinion that the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. And he was very, very interested in education for the girl child, so much so that whilst in England, he influenced his uncle, who established what was to become the first girls' school in the Scottish Highlands. The school still exists today. Kharsetji was a man of all ages, a man of varied interests. I think it is a Cama failing that we are very interested in everything around us, and Kharsetji was no exception. Apart from specializing in Iranian civilizations and old Persian languages, he took up comparative studies of the Iranian civilization, the Iranian languages, and other languages and civilizations of yore. Not content with that, he developed an avid interest in the then newly developed sciences of botany, biology, and astronomy. In his death, the citizens of Bombay and of Oriental studies lost a very rare individual and a stalwart. In the light of this, we are indeed privileged today to have Mr. Nariman address us on Through the Looking Glass, Zoroastrianism in Other Faiths. Before we continue, may I request my co-trustee and honorary secretary of this institute, Mrs. Homai Modi, to welcome our speakers with the traditional flowers. And how could we forget Mrs. Sri Krishna and Mrs. Nariman? Every year, this institute brings out a journal which is a compendium of articles pertaining to Oriental studies written by Orientalists from all over. These are original articles, well researched. May I request Mr. Justice Sri Krishna to release this year's volume. It would be presumption on my part to introduce Mr. Nariman to such an elite audience. However, for those of you who may be from the smaller towns of India, Delhi excluded, I may mention that Rohinton had his early school education from the Cathedral and John Connon School, Bombay, and thereafter went on to the Sri Ram College of Commerce, Delhi. He secured a first class, standing second in the university from the Faculty of Law, University of Delhi, and later on went on to do his master's in law from the Harvard Law School. He was made senior counsel at the young age of 37 and has practiced maritime law in America. He has practiced law extensively in India and has over 350 reported Supreme Court judgments to his credit, and is considered an expert in comparative constitutional law and civil law. Has lectured extensively all over India, is a member of the governing board, Gujarat Law School, the Mediation Committee of the Supreme Court of India, and he has also been part of a delegation from the Supreme Court of India to the Supreme Court of the United States of America in the year 2002. Keenly interested in religion, religious studies and comparative religion, Rohinton is an ordained Nava from the Tata Agyari at Bandra, Bombay, and has lectured in Philadelphia and New York on Zoroastrianism. He had the privilege to deliver the keynote address at the K.L. Misra Lecture on Spirituality and Law, along with the then Chief Justice of India and other judges of the Supreme Court in Allahabad in 2004. He has held fortnightly Gatha classes for 2 years in Delhi. He is deeply passionate and an avid researcher into Western classical music. He has terrific interest, obviously, in history, and is passionately fond of Mahabaleshwar, long treks in nature's bounty, and is a committed daily walker. With these few words, may I request Mr. Nariman to deliver his talk on Through the Looking Glass, Zoroastrianism and Other Faiths. Mr. Nariman.
Thank you, Manchi, that was very kind. Justice Sri Krishna, ladies and gentlemen. A great Sasanian priest, the Sasanian dynasty happens to be the third of the three major Persian empires that spanned almost 1,000 years. This man was a man of great practical wisdom, and among the many interesting things that he told us, in fact instructed us in, two of them apply to us immediately, one to you, the audience, and one to me as a speaker. The one that applies to you immediately, people in the first row, please beware, is that never sit in a place where you are liable to be unseated later. And the one that applies to me is that if you do have to speak, please see that you are not a bore. Now, particularly keeping in view this admonition, when I was asked to speak for a length of 2 hours, I thought it wouldn't be possible to really manage to hold your attention, among other things. So I decided that I'd speak for about 45 minutes, but I will be taking you through a long and arduous journey because it will have to be through many, many religious texts. So I beg you to please pay very, very careful attention for at least the next 20 or 25 minutes. One of the very interesting things that this great priest tossed off, and we can begin with that, is what is wisdom without courage? What is intelligence without vision? What are good thoughts and good words without good deeds? And what is wealth without generosity? It all really begins with the Rig Veda. Now, it is important to realize that the Rig Veda happens to consist of 1,017 hymns, which span some 2,000 or 3,000 years. We're not exactly sure how many. And Zarathustra, as a visionary and a prophet, in fact, he tells us in his Gathas that he is the first to ever receive a revelation from a creator God, happens to be born in the old Rig Vedic nature religion. It was fundamentally a worship of nature gods and certain other human beings who became powerful kings and who were deified after their deaths. The maximum number of verses are to Indra, who is today forgotten. There's no Indra temple in India. And of course to the great Mitra and Varun, about which a lot will be said because they are the protector gods. They were both called Asuras, which at that point of time meant Lord, the exact equivalent of our Ahura. And Zarathustra apparently was born as a Zotar, that is as a priest in this old nature religion. The 10th mandala, which is the 10th book, gives us very interesting speculations about the nature of God and whether there is one God. It's important to give you some of them to show you the background in which this man first arose and then exactly what his vision is, and then proceed to the Judeo-Christian tradition and show you how much, in point of fact, Zoroastrianism has had to do with that tradition. Now, as I told you earlier, in the 10th mandala, you have in chapter 72 a Smithi called Brahmanaspati. Now, Brahmanaspati as a Smithi is working with a bellows in front of a fire and is in fact giving breath to bodies as they are passed round to him. So this is the first interesting idea of breath creating life. That is the breath of a particular person who happens to be alive being passed on and creating life. The same chapter tells us about the Adityas, who happen to be the 8 sons of Aditi, 2 of whom are the most prominent, Mitra and Varun, as I told you earlier. The last being Martanda. Martanda meaning dead egg. And it is from that dead egg that we are all apparently descended. We move on to chapter 81, where there is another speculation, where the great architect of the universe is called Vishwakarma, and is actually fashioning the universe out of matter which happens to be there. And it is this universe that ultimately springs into being, man being the center of it. We move on now to the very important and famous Purush Shukta, which is the 90th chapter of this 10th mandala, where the idea that is now mooted is that you have one cosmic man. In fact, the entire cosmos, the universe, is subsumed in this cosmic man. 3/4 of him is in the heavens, a quarter here down on earth, and of that quarter, we find that the 4 great varnas or castes sprung from different portions of his body. The Brahman from here, the Kshatriya from the shoulder, the Vaisya from the navel and the thigh, and the Shudra from the feet. And it is only by the sacrifice of this cosmic man that the microcosm that you and I are came into being. One more speculation, interesting. You go now on to verse 121, which now gives you the speculation of everything arising from an egg. And the egg is called the golden embryo, Hiranyagarbha. And all of us are supposed now to be descended from this massive egg, which suddenly burst again, thanks to sacrifice being done by the gods. And finally now to verse 1, chapter 129, where for the first time there is this very interesting concept of a Swayambhu, which is a being that breathed on its own, and that happened to be there when there was neither existence nor non-existence. Very beautifully put. And it is this being that breathed on its own, desire arose within that being, and as a result of desire, creation came forth. Of course, the chapter ends on a very enigmatic note, which says that perhaps the gods in heaven know from whence this being came, perhaps they know not. Now, it is in this very interesting background that the great Persian prophet comes forward. Please remember that the language which he spoke was the same as Rigvedic Sanskrit. It was identical. A few inflections here and there happened to be different. Her becomes sir, cha becomes her, etc. But otherwise the language he spoke was identical. So in order to understand his hymns, which number about 200 odd, it is very important to know Rigvedic Sanskrit. He now comes onto the scene, describes himself, as I told you earlier, a zotar, that is a priest in the old faith, but tells you that for the first time he has received a revelation from one almighty creator God, who he calls Ahura Mazda. Now, as I told you earlier, Ahura is already a Rigvedic term. It's an appellation. It means Lord. Mazda is coined by him for the first time, and this is important. This is the great advancement. Mazda is broken up into 2 words. It literally means the great creator. So for the first time he tells us that there is one great creator God, there are no other gods, and this great creator God is giving him a revelation, which happens to be the first message for mankind from this particular God. Now, what is the content of that message? Let me brief upon it let me be very brief, because otherwise the message itself will take up a little time. I think it is best exemplified in 2 basic Zoroastrian prayers. One, the basic Ashem Vahu prayer, the other, the Ahunavairya prayer. Now, the Ashem Vahu, I'll say it in fact in Avestan first and then say it in Sanskrit, so that you realize that the language that the prophet spoke was exactly the same. The Avestan prayer goes thus: Ashem Vahu Vahishtem Asti, Ushta Asti, Ushta Ammai Yad Asai Vahista Ashem. Now, if I say it in Sanskrit, Justice Sri Krishna will be able to translate it immediately. Ashem Vasu Vasistem Asti, Ushta Asti remains the same, Ushta Smai Syad Asai Vasista Ashem. Meaning fundamentally that truth alone leads to happiness. The Ahunavairya prayer, which is in 3 parts, which I'll again dwell on very briefly. First part only tells us that the Ashem Vahu prayer, which has been already taught to you, is reaffirmed by juxtaposing it with persons who happen to be extremely powerful. And they tell you that these powerful gentlemen, though they appear to be remarkably powerful, etc., The real person to emulate is the Ratu, or the person who is a spiritual instructor. And why? Because he lives by the path of truth. So the first is an affirmation of this path of truth. The third part of the prayer deals with the Lord himself coming down and helping you if you happen to be of help to others. That is, you must give to persons who happen to be in need generally. The concept of charity, and of course much more. But it's the second part of this prayer with which we are directly concerned. And the second part tells us that the mind as we know it is going to receive various gifts. And these gifts will be received by it in due course if you happen to do good deeds in this life for love of God. Now, what are these gifts? This is where the great Zoroastrian reform takes over and tells us about a world vision which is completely different. The gifts begin with the end of our lives here. You are told that you have an urva. The urva is nothing but your own mind or judgment faculty which continues after death. This judgment faculty and your mind which continues after death continues to work its way or advance its way towards what is first described as Hu Urva Tat. Now, Hu Urva Tat again means the state of being, your Urva being in a state of being, but Hu means wholeness, completeness, rid of imperfection. So you are told that you are in an intermediate state, which happens to be described as the Abodam song. Can't really describe it. And you continue to advance towards Hu Urva Tat, where ultimately you make yourself fit for a resurrection that is to take place. And what is important is that this resurrection takes place after a judgment day, which is a cut-off day in point of time, after which there will be no further creation, and all human beings ultimately happen to work. They have to, of course, earn their way towards Hu Urva Tat. Only then will the concomitant arrive, the concomitant being Ameratat, which is that death is now removed. So the vision therefore is a vision of an individual judgment of the soul at death, a continuance of that soul depending upon what it has done into perfecting itself, in the sense that ultimately all of us should be able to coexist peaceably, happily, and love one another. This is the grand vision. Now, it is this grand vision which is given to mankind for the first time and stated to be given not through a human mind. You realize the difference between the various visions that I gave you in the 10th mandala of the Rig Veda and this vision. Zarathustra does not claim it is his vision. He claims that it is a vision given to him by an outside source. This is the first very, very important difference. And it is this vision now which translates itself not only into Zoroastrianism as we know it, because it's a very old religion, it has gone through many phases. But this part at least, the afterlife, has continued through each phase, with a few changes here and there, but by and large, 90% of it remains the same. The interesting point now to note is how far this had any bearing on the Judeo-Christian tradition. And with this we come now to a slightly different part of the talk. A little background is necessary before we get into the nitty-gritty of the talk. As you know, the Jews claim to be descended, as do the Arabs, from the patriarch Abraham. Now Abraham is supposed to have lived somewhere around 1800 and 1700 BC, around 100 years here and there, given here and there. You all must have heard the great story of Abraham and Isaac. Isaac's birth was as miraculous as Christ's, of course in a slightly different way, because Sarah, his wife, was way beyond the childbearing stage. And despite that, he was promised that a son Isaac would be born to, both of them. And the son Isaac came at a very late advanced stage. Isaac then, after he grows to virtually to manhood, is taken by Abraham because the Lord calls upon him to sacrifice the one thing that he gave him in late age. He does it unthinkingly, and just as he is about to strike, you remember the famous words of the Lord saying, put your dagger down. We have only tested you and we have found that you are therefore what Islam calls the first Hanif, the first person who completely surrenders to the will of the Lord. Now, it is through Abraham, Isaac and his son Jacob that modern day Israel and all the Jews are descended. Jacob is important because Jacob's other name is Israel itself. Israel meaning a struggle with an angel. Apparently he struggled with an angel in a dream, which is why he was called Israel. Now he had 12 sons, and those 12 sons were the progenitors of the 12 tribes of Israel. It is after Jacob that we move on now to the Jews being held captive, their first captivity, in Egypt. Please remember, they were not in Palestine at this point of time. They all happened to be in a place called in and around Ur, which is somewhere in Mesopotamia. And it is during this Egyptian captivity that you come across the other great prophet, Moses, to whom the first 5 books of the Old Testament, that is the Bible, are ascribed. And it is Moses then ultimately who manages to lead them out of Egypt and to the promised land, where of course ultimately Joshua takes them, and then they settle in Palestine. It is after this settlement, around 1000 BC, that their first kings arrive. The first king was Saul. Saul's son ruled for a short while, and then of course the great King David, who is known for the Psalms. And it is King David's son Solomon who built the first great Jewish temple. It is this temple that existed for about 450 years, down to around 580 BC, when the second great captivity of the Jews took place, which is when Nebuchadnezzar actually completely defeated the southern kingdom, because by then they were divided into 2 kingdoms. The northern kingdom had already gone in around 720 BC to the Assyrians. But it is this southern kingdom that ultimately then is taken over by the Babylonians, and the Jews are in their second major captivity, the Babylonian captivity. This is for about 40 years. It's at this stage that the great Achaemenian emperor, Cyrus the Great, bursts into the scene. Here again a little history needs to be related before we move on. The Achaemenian dynasty is the first real dynasty known to Zoroastrian history. The Peshtadanian and Kianian dynasties being earlier dynasties which don't exactly have any historical remnants today except in tales of bards. So the first major dynasty, Zoroastrian dynasty, the Achaemenian, consisted of the following emperors: Cyrus the Great, followed by his son Cambyses. Cambyses happened to extend the empire and include Egypt. Followed then by a cousin, Darius the Great, Darius the First, who was followed by son Xerxes, followed by grandson Artaxerxes. The reason for giving you this background is that these names are bandied about in the Bible. And in the Bible in particular, there are 6 Old Testament books which directly relate to Zoroastrianism. And this is of great interest because pre the Babylonian exile, the Jews did not exactly have any developed notions of an afterlife as to what happens after you die. Apparently they went to some shady place called Sheol, and that was it. There was no developed judgment, there was no judgment day, there was no heaven, hell, there was no resurrection. There was no eschatology as we know it. It is only after the Babylonian exile, when Cyrus the Great defeats the Babylonian king and grants the Jews complete freedom. In fact, it's interesting to note that the Cyrus cylinder, which happens to be a little clay tablet found in 1879 in Akkadian, which is an old Babylonian language, is virtually the first declaration of human rights by a conqueror to a conquered people. And in it, Cyrus says that I bow to the god Marduk, Marduk being the Babylonian god, not the Zoroastrian god. And he says, having bowed to Marduk, it is Marduk who permitted me to actually come and relieve the people of Babylon and all the other enslaved peoples from this terrible captivity of these few rulers. So I have come here as a liberator. I liberate not only you, the people of Babylon, who will continue to worship Marduk, but I liberate the Jews as well. And it is when the Jews were liberated that the Jews were actually told by an edict of Cyrus that you will be permitted to build or rebuild Solomon's temple, which was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Now, the first book with which we are directly concerned in the Old Testament is Ezra. Ezra happened to be not a prophet, but a great priest and scribe who lived at the time of Artaxerxes. If you remember, Artaxerxes was the fifth Achaemenian emperor that I mentioned. It is he who mentions how there is this famous edict of Cyrus, how it was lost. This is interesting. How the temple was never in fact rebuilt in Cyrus's lifetime, despite the fact that the Jews were given the wherewithal and actually went back to Jerusalem. But this was then discovered after his son Cambyses died in Darius the Great's time. And once that edict was discovered, Darius the Great gave funds from his royal treasury to rebuild that temple. And what is interesting today is that the Wailing Wall at which you see many Jews pray is part of that second temple. It happens to be an outer wall of the second temple built with funds from the treasury of Darius. So one book, Ezra, therefore testifies to the great indebtedness of the Jews post-exile to a great Zoroastrian king for not only freeing them, allowing them religious freedom, not imposing his faith upon them, and also giving funds so that they could rebuild their temple and worship freely there. From Ezra we come now to the second interesting book, Nehemiah. Nehemiah also lives in the time of Artaxerxes, the fifth emperor, and also tells us as to how he is sent out as a governor of Judah by Artaxerxes in order that the walls around Jerusalem be rebuilt. And the walls around Jerusalem therefore were rebuilt under Nehemiah's protection thanks to the great emperor Artaxerxes. We come now to the third and most interesting and important book from our point of view, the book of Esther. Now, Esther happens to be the only non-Judaic name in the Old Testament. It's a Persian name. It's not a Jewish name. The Jewish name is Hadassah. Apparently, there was a Jewish lady called Hadassah who was a cousin of a Jew called Mordecai. Mordecai adopts her and takes her to the court of King Xerxes. Now, Xerxes, you will remember, was number 3 or number 4 in the Achaemenian line. That is the person after Cyrus, Cambyses, Darius. It is Darius' son. He is the same Xerxes who, in a fit of pique, kicks the Hellespont because apparently the weather was so bad that his ships could not set sail to conquer Greece. Now, it is this same king around whom an entire book of the Bible is devoted. It begins with this king, it begins with the extent of his dominion. The Achaemenian dominions were very vast. They were from Sudan and Egypt in the west, right up to the Indus in the east, up to the Black Sea and the Aral Sea in the north, and up to the Persian Gulf in the south. This was the Achaemenian Empire. And it begins with Xerxes having a great feast because he had a victory over some people. And he calls for his wife Vashti, his queen. The queen refuses to come. As a result, King Xerxes gets angry with her and says that, look, I must now select another queen. Something no modern Parsi would ever dare to do. So he says that I must now select another lady. And in the selection of the lady, we must now see which are the best ones in the harem. Mordecai happens at that point of time to introduce Hadassah, now called Esther, into the harem, and Xerxes takes a fancy to her and makes her his queen. Now we come to the second interesting part of the story. There is a person called Haman who is an Amalekite. Now an Amalekite is a traditional enemy of the Jews. And this man then tells Mordecai, that is this lady Esther's adoptive father, to bow before him, knowing full well he wouldn't. He doesn't do so. So he obtains the royal seal of Xerxes and stamps a decree. And the decree is to the effect that every single Jew in the land will be put under the sword. The question was on what date. So they drew lots for the date. And the drawing of lots is called Purim, which happens to be a major festival of the Jews today. Now, the lot drawn apparently for this horrible task was 13th of Adar, because by that time the Achaemenid Empire had subsumed Palestine, and the days and months was Zoroastrian days and months. With this ghastly decree out, Esther is now asked to help her people. Xerxes still doesn't know that she is a Jewess. She arranges a banquet in which somehow she is able to expose Haman's plot. And Haman had built a gallows for Mordecai just outside. On that very gallows apparently he is strung up. And she manages to save the entire Jewish people. Now, as you know, there is that famous dictum, there is the law of the Medes and Persians. Once a law or a decree is sent out by a Persian emperor, it can never be altered. So all that you can do is to send out another decree which supersedes it. And the other decree then sent out was that the Jews will be better armed than the Persians who were to commit this ghastly deed on the 13th of Adar. And as a result, on the 13th of Adar, the Jews could get the better of their enemies. So that the Jews then went around slaughtering their enemies. And in turn, therefore, the 14th and 15th of Adar were declared great holidays. And they continue to be great holidays in Israel even today. The Feast of Purim, as it is so called, is the greatest feast after the Passover, which is their first captivity, harkens back to their first captivity in Egypt. So this entire book is devoted to a Persian emperor, to his edicts, and how ultimately the Jewish people are saved. We move on now to two other interesting books. Ezekiel, next in point of time, and another interesting book which is Isaiah. Now, Isaiah is not to be mixed up because there is an old prophet Isaiah and there is a Deutero Isaiah, a second Isaiah. We are concerned with the second Isaiah who lived around the time of the Babylonian exile. These two books show that unmistakably the Zoroastrianism of the time had by then crept into Judaism. In chapter 8 of Ezekiel, we are told there are many abominations that Jews are carrying on these days. One of them happens to be 25 persons standing outside the temple and worshipping the sun, which is of course a directly Zoroastrian thing. You are also told in the next book, Deutero Isaiah, that fasting is generally good. You will remember that fasting is considered a very important thing in the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's only in Zoroastrianism and Confucianism that fasting is not considered something fantastic. So, when you are told that fasting is good, but a true fast is not to mortify oneself, but to feed somebody poor and to do good works. Again, you have a direct influx of Zoroastrian thought and ideas, which then are accepted and taken lock, stock and barrel by the Jewish community. And now we come to the sixth book, Daniel, which is the most important of all. Because Daniel happens to live in the time both of Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, as I told you earlier, and Darius the Great. And he is a great visionary prophet who can in fact, he's a soothsayer, he can tell us what dreams mean, etc. And he therefore ingratiates himself with Nebuchadnezzar to begin with, by telling him exactly what certain dreams meant. And he actually happens to be in Babylon at the time that the famous hand comes on the wall. You will remember Belshazzar, the crown prince, was having a great feast. And suddenly a hand appears on the wall and writes the following four words: Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. Nobody knows what it means. Everybody is dazed by it. Finally, Daniel is called for. And Daniel is asked, what does this mean? He says, Mene, Mene means your days are numbered. Tekel means you have been weighed in the scales and found wanting. And Parsin means that your empire now will be divided among the Persians. And that is exactly what happened. Apparently Cyrus walks in, and as a result, the Babylonian Empire now becomes part of the Persian Empire. But more interestingly, in the visions of Daniel towards the end of Daniel, there are 4 visions. 2 of them again are directly Zoroastrian, because as I told you earlier, Jewish eschatology only went to a shady place, somewhat like the old Hades, called Sheol. You are now given 2 very clear visions, which are none other than a restatement of the Zoroastrian individual soul receiving judgment at the time of death, going on to either a heaven or hell depending upon his deeds and attempting to perfect himself, and ultimately a second vision of the Lord actually sitting in companionship with all of us in a resurrection of all souls. It's at this stage that you have a full-blown Zoroastrian series of afterlife concepts straight into Judaism. So much so that by the time that Jesus comes on the scene, which is 500 years later, the Jews are divided into 2 main sects, apart from the Essenes, which are a separate communistic group, called the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees are those Jews who accept the new teaching, that is, they believe in the resurrection. The Sadducees are those who say, no, we don't believe in this. We hearken back to our old days. And this now brings me to the 3rd stage of the talk. How far do we find Zoroastrian ideas and Zoroastrian things in Christianity? Now, you will find in an ancient Zoroastrian text, the Farvandinias, that there are 3 great saviors to be born at different points of time. But the interesting thing is, each is to be born of a virgin. So you had a concept of a virgin birth at least 1,000 years before Christ was born. Second, obviously the Zoroastrian priest was a master astrologer, for the reason that the 3 wise men who came from the east were none other than 3 Zoroastrian priests. In fact, in the old Hebrew, Old Testament, the expression used is magoi. Magoi is magi, so unmistakably a Zoroastrian priest. Wise men in the St. James version is a mistranslation. So it is 3 Zoroastrian priests who come from the east. They are obviously master astrologers because they follow some star. Having followed that star, they ultimately land up at Bethlehem. Now what is most peculiar is, Bethlehem is not the home of Christ's parents. Nazareth is. And Nazareth is in North Israel. Bethlehem is right in the south. And they happened to come to the south only because there was a census taken at that point of time. So these people were actually guided apparently by some heavenly apparition to the actual manger in which this little boy, who is born of a virgin and whom they were expecting, and finally they come with their 3 famous gifts, frankincense, myrrh and gold, give those gifts, bless the baby and go back. Christ, of course, grows up into manhood, but the New Testament is completely silent about what happens to him between the ages of 12 and 13. For that we have to wait for an Aquarian gospel, which was revealed only about 150 years ago, to an American called Dowling Levy. This gospel again makes very interesting reading, because it tells us about the lost years between 12 and 13. And it tells us about Christ's travels all the way to India apparently. He disputed with priests in the Jagannath temple. He also disputed with priests in Persia about the origin of evil, because at that point of time, Zoroastrianism had become completely dualistic. A creator God versus a devil who could counter-create. And he tells them that this is wrong. Now all this is very interesting and gives us some insight into how Christ traveled widely before he came back to Palestine and then spent perhaps the two greatest years that are known to mankind where he spread his message. And what is interesting is that after Christ dies and after the message is sought to be spread, we now have a clash with an offshoot of Zoroastrianism, another religion called Mithraism. Now you'll remember I told you that Mitra happened to be one of the old Rigvedic gods. This old Rigvedic god was thrown over by Zoroaster, didn't say anything about it. Replaced all of them by this one great creator god. However, after Zoroaster's reform, we find in the Yasna Haptangaiti, which is the Yasna of the 7 chapters and the younger Avesta, a creeping back of all the old Rigvedic divinities. So that there are actual yashs, which are hymns of praise, to persons like Mitra, Vayu, the god of the air, Som, which is the ras that Indra took to get intoxicated, which is called home among us, etc. So we have a creeping back now of the old Rigvedic divinities into Zoroastrianism. And by the time of the Parthian Empire, which is the second major empire after the Achaemenid Empire, obviously Mitra happened to be in the ascendant as a Zoroastrian soldier. Now this happened because at some interesting encounters between Parthia and Rome, Parthia managed to succeed. One of the first of them was the Battle of Carrhae, which is in 53 BC, which was fought between a Parthian general and one of the great Roman triumvirs. There were 3 of them, if you remember, Julius Caesar, Pompey and Crassus. So this battle was fought with Crassus. Crassus happened to be the same gentleman who defeated Spartacus of the slave revolt 20 years earlier. Crassus was completely defeated at this battle, and as a result of his defeat and various other defeats, apparently the great Zoroastrian god of the Parthians got transplanted into the Roman legions. And it is the Roman legions which then started erecting Mitra temples all over Europe. You will find even today a number of Mitra temples all over Europe, including in England. They are all Roman. And the similarity between Mitra and Christian ritual as we know it today is really striking. Mitra emerged out of a rock. Christ emerges out of a rock cave after spending 3 days and nights in it and claims to be resurrected. Mitra had 12 apostles. Mitra, being the sun, had 12 constellations as apostles. Christ had 12 apostles. Mitra had a last supper before leaving for the next world. Christ had a last before leaving for the next world. And above all, the Eucharist, which is basic to Christianity and which is the sort of almost cannibalistic imbibing of Christ, the ritualistic wine and bread, which are supposed to be Christ's blood and body, is nothing but an old Mithraic ritual where the bull is slain and ultimately the bull's blood is drunk and the bull's body is eaten. And you are supposed therefore to transmute yourself into that immortal bull and therefore become immortal yourself. But apart from these striking characteristics, there are 2 very interesting things that one needs to tell you. All of us celebrate Christmas, and all of us assume that it is Christ's birthday. It's very far from the truth. Christ apparently in the New Testament was born probably in May or June, because he is supposed to be born when shepherds tend their flocks by night in Palestine. No shepherd will ever tend his flocks by night on 25th December, it's too cold. Secondly, history records that 25th December happens to be, in the old days, the winter solstice, which is when the sun is at its lowest. So it is really Mitra's birthday, because Mitra is equal to the sun. And it is Mitra's birthday which is 25th December, which was a major pagan festival in the old Roman times. In fact, the Emperor Aurelian, one of the great Roman emperors, made it a compulsory festival throughout the empire. By the time of Constantine, and this is when the great change takes place, it was very important when accepting Christianity to replace all these festivals. So 25th December therefore had to be replaced. The best way of replacing it was to say that now we put Christ in the place of Mitra, which is why today we celebrate Christmas as Christ's birthday. Another very interesting thing, the early church all prayed on Saturday, which was the sacred day, which was the Sabbath day, the Jewish Sabbath day. It is Constantine who declared that it will be Sun Day, the day dedicated to Mitra, which will now be the day when everybody will pray, which is continued even till today. So we see therefore that in the great tussle between these two religions, ultimately Christianity won out. But it won out only because it was able to successfully supplant itself into Mithraic ritual. And now we come, I think, to the last, I think I've taken up enough time, to the last part of the lecture, which is, we move now about 500 to 600 years after Christ and come to Muhammad and the great religion of Islam. As you all know, the Quran again is a revelation, just as Zoroaster was revealed things by Almighty God. The Quran is a revelation by an archangel, Gabriel, to Muhammad, and the revelation is over 23 years. Muhammad lived from 570 AD to 632 and therefore was about 62 years old when he died. For the latter 23 years, he kept receiving these revelations, which were all put together and compiled into a book consisting of 114 chapters. What is interesting about the Quran is that it is the first comparative analysis of religion in a holy book, because it only restates the old Judeo-Christian tradition as it ought to be. For example, it rails against the fact that that Allah has begotten a son. It says, no, Christ was not the son of God. There is no question of Allah begetting any son. Allah is one and does not have any sons. Secondly, it also tells us something very interesting, that Christ was never in fact, he was crucified, but he never in fact died on the cross. Now with these two very interesting things, apart from these two interesting things, we are told that fundamentally the Old Testament prophets are followed, Christ is followed, he is said to be born of a virgin, he has all the great things that the New Testament say he has, the power of miracle, the power of raising people from the dead, etc., etc. But where do we now find anything Zoroastrian in this book? In chapter 22, in verse 17, we are told that there are people of the book who are Jews, Christians, Sabians, who are some Yemenis people who apparently were monotheists at that time, and Magians. So Magians, that is Zoroastrians, are expressly mentioned, and polytheists. And the verse goes on to say, they may dispute among themselves as to what is correct. Allah alone knows and will ultimately decide at the day of reckoning. So this is one verse. The other is an entire chapter called chapter 18, which is subtitled The Cave, where, interestingly enough, the great prophet Moses looks for spiritual instruction to a prophet greater than himself. That prophet is unnamed. You will find in the Quran, most of the prophets are either Old Testament prophets or Christ. There are a few Arabic prophets by name, for example, Hud, Saleh, Shoaib, etc. But this is the only unnamed prophet who is also not an Old Testament prophet. And this prophet Moses goes to for instruction. The prophet tells him that, look, I am going to do some very peculiar things. So you can follow me only if you ask no questions. Moses agrees. They set out on a journey, and the very first thing that this man does is, they happen to cross a river. He crosses the river and makes holes in the boat in which they crossed, so that the boat sinks. Moses immediately said, why are you doing this? He said, see, I told you, I warned you. You cannot ask me. If you ask me again, out you go. Moses said, I'm extremely sorry. Please allow me to carry on. They carry on. In their journey, sometime a few days later, they get into a forest. And in that forest, there is a boy innocuously sleeping somewhere. Prophet goes and kills that boy. Moses gets shocked and says, you are supposed to be a holy man. Chap tells him again, look, I give you one more chance. You are obviously not a person who's supposed to learn anything from me. One more chance and you're out. So they carry on till the city of Baghdad, where there is a wall that is crumbling. And at the crumbling wall, apparently, the great prophet who is accompanying Moses tells Moses, come on, we have to rebuild this wall. So they rebuild the wall. Again, curiosity gets the better of Moses. And Moses asks, at which point he says, all right, I don't think you can learn anything from me. I'll explain the 3 incidents to you and then off you get. Each incident was explained by the prophet saying that, look, I, unlike you, am in direct communion with the Almighty. I was told by the Almighty that the boat in which I made holes, I made advisably because of the Almighty, because there were a whole lot of other people coming behind the particular person who owned the boat, and they have taken the boat and killed him, both. So I saved his life by having the boat put under. Second, the youth I happened to kill because he would have involved his old parents in some terrible sin. I was told to do away with him so that they would bear another child who would be good to them. And the third, the Baghdad thing was that there are some orphans and apparently there's some treasure under that wall. We have to see that that treasure is safe enough so that I, as trustee of that treasure, am able to come back and give it to the person, the beneficiary, when the beneficiary reaches majority. Now what is interesting is, immediately after this particular incident takes place, we have somebody called Dhul Karnain. Now Dhul Karnain means, and has been translated by every translation of the Quran, to mean the two-horned one. So there is some two-horned one who is mysterious and who apparently is a great king who has in fact, like the Emperor Hadrian, built a wall in the northern part of his empire so that raiding tribes could not come in and peace would be restored thereby. We find in the book of Daniel, we go back now to the Old Testament, chapter 8, the third vision of Daniel is a two-horned person. And the interesting thing about that vision is that it is given by Archangel Gabriel. Please remember, it is Archangel Gabriel who reveals the Quran to Muhammad. So it is Archangel Gabriel, the same Archangel, speaking to Daniel now, much before, about 800 years before. And now telling Daniel that this two-horned one, he explains the dream of the two-horned one, is none other than a Persian emperor. Now if it is a Persian emperor, and historically we find that it is Darius the Great, not Cyrus, who strengthened the northern boundaries of his empire. So if Darius the Great is referred to, immediately after this thing about the unknown prophet or the unnamed prophet and Moses, I don't think it's a great leap to say that that unnamed prophet is none other than Zoroaster. If in fact it is Zoroaster, it will lead to a couple of startling consequences. One, Zoroaster's date, which is wholly unknown to us, will become fixed, because he is obviously somebody who lived at the time of Moses, which would make him around 12 to 1300 BC. And the other is that if it is Zoroaster and he is a prophet who is of that magnitude that Moses goes to him for instruction, then obviously the age-old controversy in Islam as to whether Magians are Kitabiyars, that is believers or non-believers, gets completely settled. Now, therefore, the object of this short talk, because I find it's very difficult, I could go on prattling, very, very difficult to sort of compress all this into the 45 minutes allotted to me. I've done my best. And I would only sum up now by telling you that what I have found in the course of my research, therefore, leads me to conclude that this long forgotten religion, Zoroastrianism, because now it has very few adherents, is in fact a very, very important religion in the history of humanity, because it happens to be the only link between the old Rig Veda on the one hand and the Judeo-Christian tradition on the other, together with the fact that a variant of Zoroastrianism, Mithraism, as I told you earlier, happened to vie with Christianity and ultimately gave Christianity most of its rituals. Thank you very much for your patience. I don't think I could carry on very much further.
Justice Sri Krishna, whose name is synonymous with the commission he headed to look into the 92-93 Bombay riots, began his career as an advocate of the Bombay High Court in 1962, specializing in the field of labor and industrial law. He was soon designated senior advocate and has appeared in a number of cases in the High Courts as well as the Supreme Court, which laid down fundamental principles of labor law. In the year 2001, he was appointed as Chief Justice of the Kerala High Court, and thereafter, in 2002, a judge of the Supreme Court of India, which office he demitted only in May 2006. His deep interest in philosophy, culture, music and education made him a much sought after and respected figure in all the musical gatherings, religious organizations, cultural and education institutions of Bombay. He was a trustee of the Shanmukhananda Fine Arts and Sangeet Sabha, Bombay, and he studied how to play Carnatic music on the violin. His abiding interest in music and musicology led to his being invited by the Veena Foundation to deliver a talk on Veena in Delhi. Apart from getting his master's in law from the University of Bombay, Mr. Justice Sri Krishna also holds a Master of Arts degree in Sanskrit from the Mysore University and a diploma in Urdu, quite apart from a postgraduate diploma in Indian aesthetics from the University of Bombay. He is multilingual and speaks at least 7 languages fluently. May I request you, Mr. Justice Sri Krishna, to say a few words.
Mr. Cama, Mrs. Modi, Ms. Nawaz Modi, and my dear Rohinton. Ladies and gentlemen, I assure you that it was not love of the chair that held me back, and my coat had got stuck onto it, that's all. I never had love of any chair. I have had opportunity of interacting with Rohinton on several religious and philosophical issues, sometimes inside the court and mostly outside the court. Every one of these sessions I found was very illuminating, and I have learned a lot from what he said. Ultimately, although Rohinton has tried to project a view that Zoroastrianism has its parallel, its roots elsewhere in the Rigvedic religion, from where it makes a leap into the Judaism, from where there is a branch out to Islam. Ultimately, what is it that he has said? He says that take any religion, ultimately what you will find is that good thoughts are there in all the religions. So if you have a comparative study of religions, of which Rohinton Nariman is a scholar, you will pick up good thoughts, identify them and say, hey, what is there in this religion is there in this religion, in another religion, and try to integrate humanity and not divide humanity on the basis of religion. It's true. Way back, thank you. Way back during the Rigvedic period itself, the Rigveda in terms says, Ekam sadvipra bahudha vadanti agnim varudam mata rishwana bahuhu. He says there is only one truth. Vipraha, the scholarly people, try to give different names to it. Some people call it Agni, some people call it Varna, some call it Indra, some call it Matarishwa. Ultimately it is the same. In fact, the Kathopanishad says, it gives a very graphic instance and says, just as water which falls on the mountain peak takes different paths, but ultimately comes and joins the river. Similarly, all religious thoughts, all thoughts about the gods must merge into that one truth, which is what the truth that humanity is after. Much later, subsequently, maybe around the 4th or 5th century, there was a great poet, great religious mind who said, Ruchinam vaichitriat bahukutila nadapathachusam nranam eko gamyaha tvamasi payasam arnavaiva. He says, people think of different religious concepts. Why do they do it? Because each mind has a different appreciation. And in order to appease their mind, they think of truth in a different fashion. Some take one path, some take another deviant path. But ultimately, Payasam Arnavaiva, just as the mighty ocean is the repository of all rivers, all these thoughts go and merge, which is what we call God. True. In fact, I had an occasion to listen to a very great Islamic scholar who was a professor in the university in Cairo. And he was explaining that even in Islam, Islam does not say that all religions other than Islam are false. Islam does a very peculiar thing. He says, Gabriel, all right, he was an angel. Zarathustra, he was an angel. They all accept that these are godly men in the sense they have had revelations from God. Not only that, he went one step and said, and he quoted a couple of verses. I wish I could someday study Arabic and look into it. He quoted a couple of verses in surahs of Quran and said that Rama, Krishna, all the deities that the Hindus worship, we accept them as angels. But the God is someone above him. Ladies and gentlemen, this is precisely the philosophy of the Hindus. Some people have a wrong notion that Hindus, in fact the British propagated this idea and said Hindus are stupid people. They go around worshipping a stone, an animal, a mountain or a river. No. What they worship is really that truth, the entity that stands behind it. Navid pashane naiva vidyate devo navakashthe navatrane bhavehi vidyate devo tasmad bhavohi karanam. That is the principle. The truth or the God does not reside in the wood of which you make a deity's form, nor in the stone of which you sculpt a deity's form, nor in the metal that you use. But where does it reside? It resides in your heart. It resides in your feeling. Take away the feeling, rest of it is meaningless. This is precisely the teaching of any religion in the country that you take. Religions, on the contrary, should have been integrative forces. But unfortunately, we, the human beings, on account of our short-term thinking, on account of our own selfishness, look at the divisive factors, emphasize them, and try to set up each one against them. One wishes that there were more scholars in the mold of Rohinton who would look at what is common amongst all of them, find out a desideratum on which humanity can rest its thinking. Unfortunately, we have pseudo-scholars who keep on emphasizing the wrong things and set up one against the another. I don't think I should give a counter speech. Someday maybe I will talk about how to look through the glass and see Hinduism in every religion of the world. I'll just quote what the Mandukya Upanishad says. The Mandukya Karika says, after all you must remember, the basis of the Hinduism right from the time of Rigveda is that there is only one entity, one truth. Rest of it is all appearance made for the purpose of appeasement of our own mind. The Mandukya Shruti very pithily puts it and says, Swasiddhanta vyavasthasu dvaitino parinishtitaha parasparam virudhyante tairayam na virudhyate. He says, as far as we are concerned, there are only two categories. one is the Advaitin. According to him, everything is only one unity, nothing exists beyond that. Rest of the world is Dvaitin. So he will say, I exist, God exists. I exist, 1,000 gods exist. I exist, 1 million gods exist. He says, Dvaitino parinishthitaha. Each one of the Dvaitin will think that what he says is correct, what his religion says is correct. The moment you accept this, another man will get up and say, no, what my religion says is correct. Therefore, Dvaitino parinishthitaha parasparam viruddhyante. There is always scope for this kind of disagreement. Dairayam na viruddhyate. For the man who has got an integrative vision, he has no opposition at all. He says, all right, you are a Zoroastrian. Yes, I accept Zoroastrian. You are an Islamic scholar. I accept you are being a Muslim. I accept you are being a Christian, a Judaist, follower of the Judaism or any other religion. This is the integrative vision that one must develop as a result of listening to such scholarly lectures by real scholars. And finally, one last thing, what does it result in? The great Shankaracharya, a great visionary, a great integrative visionary of this country, around 8th century, said something very pithily. He said, Tvayi mayi chanyatraiko vishnuhu, vyartham kupyasi mayi asahishnuhu, sarvatratvam pashyatmanam, sarvasminnapi bheda, utsruja bheda jnanam. He says, oh my friend, the Vishnu, the good Lord, is there in your heart, is in my heart. So he is there with you, he is inside me. So why do you have to get quarrelsome with me? Why do you have to lose your temper? Why do we have to kill each other? So the moment you forget these external divisions that you have, these non-real divisions that we have ourselves created, the artificial barriers that we have created, what we see is ourselves in every human being, and that is really what leads to the path of peace. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. We wish we could absorb all that has been said by all the religion, never